Britain's Muslim community reacts to Prime Minister David Cameron's strategy for tackling extremism, with some complaining it'll lead to further stigmatisation. Plus,
It's a little child! What are you doing to him? It's a little child!
Human Rights Watch says Israeli forces are guilty of choking, beating and abusing Palestinian children. And Canadian police come under cyber attack as hackers vow revenge over the shooting of an activist in British Columbia. Live from the RT News Centre at 5 p.m. here in Moscow. Thanks for being with us wherever you're watching around the world. My name's Kevin Owen. We're starting in Britain this hour, where the Muslim community is debating the new 5-year counter-extremism strategy that's been laid out by the country's Prime Minister.
So this is how I believe we can win the struggle of our generation. Countering the extremist ideology by standing up and promoting our shared British values. Taking on extremism, all its forms, both violent and non-violent.
Well, here are some of the counter-extremism measures that were announced in brief. First off, communications regulator Ofcom is going to have new censorship powers. Also, in the home, parents worried the kids may be joining radicals abroad will be allowed to cancel their children's passports to prevent travel if they've got worries. Furthermore, internet companies are being pushed to help the government identify potential terrorists online. Well, shortly after the speech, obviously there was a lot of mixed reaction came in. I say, obviously, Muslim leaders, they were confused, some calling David Cameron's speech contradictory and oversimplified. The UK Ramadan Foundation insisted that everyone in the country, including Muslims, has the right to make their feelings felt, even if those views are intolerant ones. Good point. While the Muslim Council for Britain said it was concerned that Cameron's speech didn't focus on dealing with the root causes of Islamophobia itself. We got some reaction too from British Muslim commentator Mohammed Ansar shortly after PM's speech.
David Cameron was pointing the finger at Muslims community and saying, you are responsible for not being more forward, for not being more progressive and not being more outspoken, and this is almost tacit complicity with some of the extremist views. It is an incredibly divisive speech. I think Muslim communities are saying we are working really, really hard, although I have to say, for once, on a personal basis, I'm quite happy with the speech. I think the positive messages about Muslims being integrated in British society, they're vital messages.
David Cameron there denying them the link between British foreign involvements and the increase in the number of radicalised Muslims. Now, on the other side of the Atlantic, the debate over radicalisation rages on as well. We can reveal a retired US general has recently said that disloyal Americans should be thrown into internment camps.
If these people are radicalized and they don't support the United States and they're disloyal to the United States as a matter of principle, fine, that's their right. It's our right and our obligation to segregate them from the normal community.
Is that the way forward or not? Well, let's get some thoughts on it with independent political analyst Dan Glazebrook joining us. Pretty harsh rhetoric there from Wesley Clark, wasn't it? I mean, do you think yourself segregating people who've been radicalised anywhere, be it in Britain, be it in the US, is going to help battle radicalisation itself or not?
Well, no, and it's important to remember that the US and British governments, neither of them are actually interested in fighting radicalization or extremism per se. In fact, they're both facilitating extremism as a tool of foreign policy in the Middle East, particularly in Syria, where since 2011 in Libya and Syria they've been facilitating these kind of extremist groups as a means to undermine and weaken and destroy independent states like Libya and Syria. And in fact, giving the intelligence powers, the intelligence services more powers, which is what Cameron is proposing, which is the kind of thing Wesley Clark's proposing, well, actually, all it will serve to do is give more leverage to the intelligence agencies who actually have been caught, implicated now in colluding and actually facilitating the flight of people from the West to go and fight in Syria. So it would give them more leverage to actually blackmail vulnerable young people to join these groups. They're very open that they have many agents in ISIS and Al-Qaeda and so on. Of course, they would argue it's to destroy these groups from within. The reality is it's more likely so that they can use those groups more effectively as a tool of foreign policy. And giving intelligence services more powers will serve to aid them in their recruitment of vulnerable young people to go into these organisations, the better to control
But
them.
there are a lot of people, of course, that are worried about ISIS, ISIL, whatever you want to call it, and they would agree with Wesley Clark. The problem is, what are the dangers of implementing this idea? You know, how do you work out if someone's, for instance, merely visiting an extremist site? Does that count as not sharing US values? Where do you draw the line? Who implements this? Who decides who's not sharing US values, for instance?
Well, exactly. And what's interesting is that Cameron's been talking about this idea in particular for years now, this idea of combating non-violent extremism. And he's never really sought to actually define it. And I think its amorphous nature is part of the, is part of the appeal of this kind of strategy. General fear-mongering about the idea that actually you're going to give governments and police forces and intelligence agencies the power to crack down on extremism, and there's an obligation on all public services, including schools, universities and so on, to crack down on extremism and radicalism without ever really defining what it is. Of course, that's going to make people err on the side of caution and make, make all of these institutions worried about taking on anyone with what might seem to be a non-mainstream type of idea or political thinking and so on. Actually, it's a tool of trying to scare people away from getting involved in the political arena whatsoever, in my opinion.
But people are scared. I mean, how much backing do you think people like Wesley? How much backing do you think people like Wesley Clark has got here over in America? It is the great melting pot, but people are worried about attacks from ISIS, etc., etc. Do you think he's got backing, the great public?
I think it has a certain amount of backing, yeah, because the fear-mongering's been very effective. And of course, the actual activity of groups like ISIS, which, as I say, kind of ironically, paradoxically, whatever, have actually been, their rise has been facilitated by the West. But the kind of activities and atrocities that they're involved in, of course, do put fear into people's minds. But, it's interesting, the kind of thing, because Cameron talked about, we're going to combat extremism. You might think that he's talking about Wahhabism, which is the specific ideology that Al-Qaeda and ISIS both adopt. But actually, the biggest supporter and facilitator of Wahhabism is Saudi Arabia, and the biggest weapon suppliers and the biggest supporters of Saudi Arabia are US and Britain, and they're not proposing to change that. So what is he talking about, this extremism, this ideology? And if you actually look at in some detail, Cameron wrote an article a couple of weeks ago for The Telegraph, and he specifically, as his first example of a criteria of a radical would be someone who opposes the West or says that the West is evil or whatever, or says the West is bad.
Well, are you saying David Cameron doesn't care, or are you saying
he's
just not being open about this and he's calling everyone's bluff? What are you saying?
Well, I think he's deliberately leaving the definition of extremism vague, like I say, so that in order to try and depoliticize the whole population, make people scared of speaking their mind, lest they become subject to an internment.
More and more people are joining the jihadi ranks. So what can be done? What can be done to stop them? And just really quickly, you can't. It's not a quick answer, I know, but in 30 seconds, what do you think should be done as a headline then?
Well, I mean, the government should stop the media should stop glorifying them. Every time the media tries to demonize ISIS, it effectively glorifies them. Every time it splashes, these schoolgirls who went to Syria to fight on the front pages and makes it headline news, it turns them into celebrities. That encourages more people to go. The government should stop funding. If it was serious, it would be supporting people who are fighting against those groups effectively, like the Syrian government, for example, rather than trying to undermine the Syrian government, which is one of the only bulwarks against ISIS left. So these are the kinds of things that it would be doing if it was serious about tackling that, but it's not.
Dan, thanks for your thoughts. Dan Glazebrook, their independent political analyst on the line from Oxford there in the UK. Human Rights Watch says Israeli security forces have abused Palestinian children as young as 11, choking, beating and forcing them to confess. Here, in fact, the accounts of some of the victims from the group's new report.
Policemen grabbed the back of my jacket and lifted me off the ground. I was choking.
They put a black cloth bag on my head. They kicked me in the shin, and my leg turned different colors. I was freezing. They kept putting me into a car and taking me out.
I was put in a chair next to some stairs. The soldiers would hit me on the way up and down for what seemed like the 12 hours I was there.
Israel defends its actions of its security services, saying that all proceedings met the requirements and standards of developed criminal law enforcement. But Human Rights Watch representative Sarah Sadoun says the practices violate both international and Israeli law.
Human Rights Watch saw a video and several photos that supported the accounts of the children we spoke to, but Israel says that everything was done in accordance with Israeli law. In many of the cases, happened with unnecessary use of force, so chokeholds, batons, stun grenades. In some of the cases, the kids were also beaten before they were taken to the interrogation, being refused the right to have a parent present during interrogations. In some cases, also threatened with violence, as well as other violations of international human rights law. And for some of this, it also violates Israeli law.
It's not the first time Israeli security forces have been accused of treating Palestinian children this way either. Heavily armed Israeli soldiers seen here raiding Palestinian homes in February, waking up children while searching their home. Another case, here's a 7-year-old boy detained by several soldiers. And this one, the arrest of a 12-year-old in October last year, reportedly had a mental illness. While this video coming up was shot last December, we showed it to you at the time, it shows dogs used by soldiers to intimidate a Palestinian boy.